Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Interfaith Paths to Peace. My name is Judd Hendricks. I'm the Executive Director, and this is our Tuesday Cultivating a Soul-Centric City Zoom conversation. Thanks for joining in. Those of you that have been following us this year, welcome to another wonderful conversation. The purpose of the Soul-Centric City project is to cultivate a holistic developmental path from cradle to grave, uplifting and utilizing the resources of our city. That's the object for 2022. And then in 2023, we're actually going to be creating some things together that we feel like maybe Louisville needs to create. And I think this conversation falls into that category on the conversation of spirituality and education. And I'm excited to have Amy Chapman and Jim McGuire here. I'll introduce them a little bit more in a moment. But if you're joining us on Facebook, you're welcome to put a comment in the comment section, and I'll try to bring that in if you have a question for our panelists or for the conversation. Those of you that are joining on Zoom, I want to welcome you, and we'll have an opportunity for you to engage in the conversation as we get going a little bit. Again, the topic of our conversation is spirituality and education. This topic has emerged in a variety of places as we've been looking at a holistic developmental path from cradle to grave in Louisville. And how do we integrate or think about spirituality outside of a religious context? And this is one of the tricks that we're going to get into as we start talking about spirituality and education, especially spirituality and public education, is how do we bring these deeper values and practices for holistic development that come often out of our religious traditions, but are not religious ideology. And so we're going to talk some about that languaging, how to move forward in that. And Jim McGuire at Collegiate, they are doing a great job of integrating that. We'll hear some more about that. And Amy Chapman, as you'll hear in a few moments, has done a lot of wonderful research in this area. And so we'll talk about that as well. So welcome everyone to our conversation. I do want to introduce our guest. Amy Chapman is the director of the Collaboration of Spirituality and Education and a research fellow at Teachers College, both of which are at Columbia University. And Jim McGuire is the associate head of school at Louisville Collegiate School. And they are integrating some of this work that Amy's going to share into their culture and curriculum. So without further ado, I want to jump into the conversation. Amy, thank you so much for being on the conversation today. If you can tell us a little bit more about yourself, about all the work that you all are doing with the Collaborative for Spirituality and Education. And I'm interested in why you got engaged in this work. It's always important to hear our stories. So share a little bit about that as well. Amy, welcome. Thanks for being on today.
Oh, Judd, it's a delight. Thank you so much for inviting me and for making space for this conversation. It's always good to be, I know I said this before, it's always good to be in conversation with people, particularly my friend Jim McGuire. So I think this is going to be fun. Truly, thanks for having me. I'm going to start with that. Why did I get engaged in this work? I've been a teacher for 20 years. I taught high school history, but when people have asked, I would say I taught kids. And it's a very different framing than I think a lot of teachers actually have, but we tend to fall back into our patterns of answering the question the way that I did initially, right? I taught high school social studies. From the very beginning of my teaching career, I felt like a little bit of an outlier. I was very much more concerned with who my kids, and I still call my graduate students kids, so that's never left, who my kids were, and how to support them in their holistic developmental path. I like that turn of phrase, right? And that made their learning of the content that I was helping them to know richer, deeper, more important, because I could connect it to their lives. But more than that, and it maybe this is easier for me to see in a social studies department, Uh, we're asking kids to go out into the world and carry on our society. That's how our country works. And for them to be able to do that, it's not just head knowledge, it's how to be a person knowledge. It's how to know that we are deeply interconnected with everybody else knowledge. It's putting those things in concert to be able to act in the world from that deeply grounded place. And I saw that from the get go as part of my responsibility. 20 years ago, I did not have language around that. I could not have told you what I can tell you today. The research hadn't been done and the language wasn't developed. So, to go from there to where I am now, the Collaborative for Spirituality and Education is a center for research and teaching at Teachers College at Columbia University. And so we have spent about 5 years collecting data and analyzing it to understand how schools support spiritual development in kids. They also do it in adults, but we were looking primarily at how they're doing it in kids, for kids, with kids, preschool through grade 12. So the wide range of people who show up in schools. And we went to schools that we identified as already spiritually supportive and said, what are you doing? And we asked teachers and we asked administrators and we asked staff and we asked students and we asked parents and we asked alumni. And in some cases, we asked people in the community, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And why are you doing it? From that, and also a bunch of artifacts, right? So schools would send us their mission statement, their handbook, lesson plans, case studies, lots and lots of data. We came up with the drivers of a spiritually supportive school, which Judd so kindly put the link to our website in the chat. You can find them and a funky graphic that shares about them on our website there. Those drivers are able to be used by any school because they're culturally supportive and actionable. We don't tell you how you need to do it. We point you in the direction of things that are important. So, for instance, all of the schools that we studied took time to have their students spend time in nature. That was important. As was the way that schools talked about nature. It was about being in right relationship with the natural world. Another one that I know Collegiate has been working on this year is ritual, as well as language. So how do we talk about this? And are we using the same words when we talk about it? So if I'm talking about my spirituality, you need to be able to understand what I'm saying. Otherwise, that connection isn't as deep as it could be. And that needs to be school-wide language. It doesn't mean that you need to use my language at your school. In fact, you shouldn't. You should use the language that works in your school community. But you as a school community need to make sense of what that is. And then what do we ritualize? What do we name as important and commemorate or celebrate? How do we as a community gather and say, these are our values and this is how we instantiate it in our community? There's a whole bunch more. You can look on our website or I can talk more about it. I feel like I've already been talking for a while. And I think I missed whatever the middle question that you had was there, but that's kind of my holistic developmental path. So maybe I'll turn it over to Jim and you can throw it back to me when you're ready for more research or whatnot. Sound okay?
Great. Yeah, Jim, I want to get into, actually, Amy, let me go back to you for a sec. Can you help? Do you have a definition that you use for spirituality when you talk about the spiritual life of people? Do you have some framing around that language?
We intentionally don't define spirituality. So science can tell you that there's 4 regions of your brain. When they work in tandem, there's lots of parts of your brain, but there are 4 particular regions of your brain that when they work in tandem, create a sense of augmented awareness. It means that you are in a position where you are more receptive to being in connection with the universe, whatever you call the creative life force that exists within us, between us, around us, that is bigger than us. Whatever you name that, that's okay. For us, when we say spirituality, it's when someone's in that state of receptivity and develops for themselves and in community practices which help them to get into that state. We can't be in that state all the time. We'd never get anything done. But to be in that state has shown enormous protective benefits, resilience benefits, psychosocial benefits, all sorts of things. We can talk about that. That's the scientific understanding of spirituality. There's also an experiential piece of spirituality. So I know for myself when those four regions of my brain are
Mm,
engaged.
mhm,
I've met lots of people who do. I've met preschool kids who do. But sometimes we don't nurture and support that in a way that is us seeing it, recognizing it, and saying, yes, that's a good thing. Keep going to that space. Here are some things that you can try to keep that part of your brain engaged. And then science tells us, and experience probably tells us too, that part of the brain is harder to access. And so that's really why we do the work that we do, to make sure that schools can keep going back to that place and supporting students in keeping that part of their brain that they were born with, that there comes standard on kids, that continues to be nourished and continues to grow. In that way, spirituality is kind of like any other line of development. So if you're looking at this holistic developmental path, all the other things that kids have that need to be nurtured in order to fully develop, whether that's physical maturation or literacy development or math skills, they need to be supported. You come with the capacity to learn and do those things, but if you're not in the right environment, then they don't fully blossom. So
mm. Thank you, Amy. There's a lot of wisdom there, and I appreciate you all not trying to define it, and allowing some freedom there, and yet trying to say we are talking about something. And so to call it a line of development, I think is exactly the way to go, because we can cultivate that spiritual line of development either in a religious tradition or outside of religious tradition, that it doesn't have anything to do with our ideology necessarily. It has to do with this: what does it mean to be human? Is that we have a spiritual element. And I think calling it that as a line of development is really wise. And so we can talk about that some more. But Jim, I want to get you in on the conversation. I do have to come clean. I'm just a huge fan of Jim anyway. Jim nurtured three of my children at Louisville Collegiate School. And so I have a deep place in my heart for people who have cared for my own kids. And so I know this is not only something that Jim is interested in professionally, but it's something that he practices, and my family has benefited from it. So Jim, thanks for being on the call today. Would love to hear, a little bit about how Collegiate is doing some of this work and integrating it into school, but would also love to hear a little of your story about how you got into this work and what you find meaningful about it. Thanks, Jim.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Judd. And yeah, I'm thrilled to just be able to do something like this with you, Judd, and then you as well, Amy. This is quite a treat and an honor. I know Rob, our head of school, would love to be on this Zoom right now with all of us. Wasn't able to make it due to his schedule, but and I'll get to that in a second. But he has been a critical player in all of this, and so I'll talk more about that. My own personal story, it's been really wonderful to be engaged in this work, or deeply for the last 3 or so years, because it's given me an opportunity to kind of look back on my professional, my personal life with a different kind of perspective. And looking back on it, it's like I can see how, whether it was in my own personal life, teams that I played on that had a real, what I would call the magic ingredients for transformative school culture or transformative culture. I didn't have the language, or I didn't always recognize it. I couldn't maybe define it as such, but what I knew was that it was a place where I felt, cared about. I felt, that we were all working towards something bigger. And I was a part of something bigger than just myself. And then I think also, just my own personal kind of background, growing up, I had, I was fortunate to have a lot of transformative, what I would call transformative relationships that were in my life. I was a kid that had a collection of different risk factors that meant it was going to be less likely for me to do a whole bunch of things based on the statistics and whatever. And I only know that now, looking back. I didn't know that then. But I also know that I had some people in my life that, my mom being a primary one in my life, and then also some teachers that really, they engaged with me in a way that meant that they were able to help me through some of those risk factors and things like that, things that were outside of my control, but nevertheless were part of my story. And so it's interesting looking back on those and recognizing, well, yeah, okay, so statistically, I had this, and this in my life. It's this is how I made it through, is through these like transformative relationships. So it's been wonderful to kind of look back on my own personal life to this point. Professionally speaking, like I was the educator who came to education because I was drawn to counseling. And that was really, my first kind of job in education was to work at a residential program, a summer residential program where I worked with students, elementary and middle school students who had different academic challenges, social emotional challenges, so on and so forth. And I was a teacher therapist at that program. And for me, it was just a really, I loved education because of the holistic nature of development that was a part that I could be a part of. And so for me, I went on to counseling to get a degree in both mental health and school counseling. And that was what I wanted to do in schools. It wasn't, like a lot of folks will go into teaching and then maybe find their way to counseling. I was coming to it via counseling first and foremost. And I think that, through that experience, that training, and then I was in public schools for about 12 years, and then I've been in an independent school now for about 9. It was, for me, it was a chance to just really get engaged in the holistic development of students and come at it not just from a purely academic perspective, but a social emotional perspective. I didn't use this language at the time, but now I do, that spiritual piece, that spiritual perspective, and had for a long time been interested and engaged in this work of how do we develop kind of that inner self or that inner core. That's just as critical and just as important as any other part of a human being's development. How do we get actively engaged in that? And how do we actively engage in their development of in terms of their connections to stuff that's bigger than themselves, whatever that may be for them? Like, how do we nurture that? How do we honor that and develop that? So that's all to sort of take me to where I was, maybe, I guess it was 4 years ago or so. And I was a part of a head of school search here at Collegiate to help identify our next head of school, and had the opportunity to be a part of that process. And we were very much as a school looking, I think, and we maybe didn't articulate it quite this way, but we were looking for someone that was really going to come in and be that holistic education leader for our school. And so we were fortunate enough to find Rob McCrae, who's our current head of school. And Rob really came in with a really clear and strong vision that, he wants this place to be the healthiest school for kids to grow up, and healthiest in a really comprehensive way. So the mind, the body, and the spirit. And we can't ignore one element, one component. We as human beings aren't compartmentalized that way. So we really have to look at the whole human being when we're talking about development and whatnot. And Rob brought this clear vision, and he also had done years and years of work to get to that vision prior to coming to Collegiate, and had relationships with various folks and whatnot, and had brought those into our community as well, which is how we initially got connected to Collegiate, got connected to Teachers College and the Collaborative for Spirituality and Education, and Amy's work. And I see Frank and David on here, which is wonderful. A couple of our board members there at the CSC. It's wonderful to have them. And Dr. Lisa Miller and the work that she's done in this space. And so Rob really helped to facilitate the coming together of our organization with their organization. And it's been wonderful for us to dive into that, into this work. For us, I mean, it's really about how do we practically apply these things that Amy and her research and Dr. Miller's research has taught us, to really look at these 11 drivers of transformative culture and see them as these magic ingredients, and how do we activate those. I mean, Collegiate's a school for over 100 years, has been doing a lot of this stuff already, and so it wasn't like starting from scratch, but it, we wanted to bring some more intentional focus to this work. And so when we think about something like rituals and ceremonies and oh, hang on one second here. I need to turn off my, I apologize. When we look at something like even our rituals, for example, which is one of the 11 drivers, it's like, okay, our rituals, are they doing what we want them to do? Are they demonstrating our values to our community the way we want? What's the purpose of this ritual? And do we believe it's contributing to a transformative culture, or is it not? And so it's been great for us because it's given us a nice framework to really kind of evaluate ourselves as an institution holistically, to look at how are we doing with these ingredients for transformative culture, and then also a lot of just great language around transformative relationships. And we know that these are important, these are critical in the growth and development of our students' lives. How do we as a school, how do we sort of, how do we all level up and train up ourselves so that we can have more of these transformative relationships on a more regular basis with each other, with our colleagues, and with our students, most importantly. So I think I got it in both of your things, Judd, there, but if I didn't,
no, we can get into the weeds a little bit more. Yeah, and I want to jump back to Amy. Amy, can you talk about some of the resources, some of the research findings, some of the things you're doing with the collaborative, kind of what you all are offering to schools and to people that are interested in doing this work?
Absolutely. So Jim is a great sharer of our research because he used a whole bunch of our findings in his conversation just now. So if you look at our website or think back or look back at what Jim was saying about transformative relationships, ritual, language, that's all coming from our data. So we identified these 11 drivers through our research. Those are our findings. What we do now is to support schools in applying them to change their school culture. We can do that, and we do that at the school level. We've been working with collegiate. It feels like for a really long time, in the very best way to say that, it feels like I've known Jim forever and that I've been part of the collegiate family forever, right? It's just lovely. We work with schools on the whole school level, and I had the very great privilege of going to collegiate in March and meeting a whole bunch of teachers and staff and students, and just spending a really great time there. We also work with individual teachers through the Awaken Schools Institute. Collegiate was a part of that, as were 7 other schools, which was an online course last academic year, so fall 2021 to spring 2022, where schools as a group, or teachers individually, and some teacher educators came to us for 12 sessions online to learn about our research and to start to think about how they could put it into practice, whatever their role was in a school. So if they were a classroom preschool teacher, if they were the art teacher, if they were the school nurse. We didn't have any school nurses in our program this year, but we do have them in our data. Nurses are great. Or if they were in administration like Jim, or even at a district level. So how, from your vantage point, can you start to incorporate these drivers into what it is that you do? So we work with both schools and individuals. We will be starting this summer to work at the district level in one mid-sized city in the United States. So to look at how this work unfolds across a school district. So that's kind of what we've been doing, and how we are inviting people to apply our research. And it's really interesting because the schools we work with, there's just a great variety of them, both in terms of where they're located, how big they are, the school, the students that they serve. So whether it's an elementary school, a middle school, a high school, or a school that has all of those grades, public, private, religious, or secular. And we find that this work works in all of those places, in part because the schools that we did our research in were all reflected in our sample. So we went into all of those schools.
Amy, I want to pull up a screen that has these 11 indicators that you've been talking about, because I think this is a really nice wheel that talks about some of these drivers that you've been mentioning. Are there any, is there anyone here that you are finding that you have a lot of real energy around, or that's most interesting that you want to go a little bit deeper into?
I
I,
appreciate.
well,
Yep.
let me tell you one that I'm interested in, this idea of, and I'm not sure where it comes in. There's a connection to awe, is, I don't know, or this sense that we all have this part of ourselves that wants to connect beyond ourselves, whether we would just call that in a relationship with another person, or relationship with nature. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe some of the research around awe, or moving into your heart center and connecting through that? Either of those are really fascinating to me.
Absolutely. I think that shows up in three of those drivers, actually. One is authentic core. So it's kind of where your cursor is.
Mm-hmm.
I have a love-hate relationship with this graphic because you can only really read it half of it at one time. So yep, so thank you. Authentic core is really the spirit or the soul of the child. And if anybody spent time with really young kids and allowed them to just wander and wonder, there's a sense of awe there. There's they don't have the limits that older kids or adults have put on what's okay to say, what's okay to put in relationship to the transcendent or the universe. They just are in awe of being. And that's something that we can cultivate in people of any age. And it's tapping into that um, deep spirit that's in each of us. And schools in our study worked really hard to do that. Awe also shows up in both transcendent practices and in nature. So, how do we draw out that authentic core? By the way in which schools get kids into nature and talk about nature, right? I'm hoping that everybody who's listening to this now or later has had an experience in the natural world where they are filled with awe. There is so much beauty and grandeur in the world, whether that's, me looking outside my window right now. I'm in northern New Jersey, and just seeing that all of the flowers seem to be in bloom right now. And we had this tremendous thunderstorm last night, and it couldn't be a more lovely day today. Or the really, amazing natural experiences. I wish I knew Louisville better, that I could name one for you right now that's in town. So maybe Jim can help me out there. But I believe when I was driving, I crossed over some lovely river from
Yeah.
Cincinnati into Kentucky, to the Grand Canyon or Mount St. Helens or Victoria Falls. These amazing things that we can go to sometimes and just be in awe, right? And so schools get kids out into nature and help them to not only treat nature with reverence, but to see that kind of amazing, inspiring, jaw-dropping experience that we're a part of, right? It's not separate from us. We're not the masters of it. We're in relationship with it, and we're part of it. We're part of that thing that is awesome.
Mm.
Transcendent practices are things that schools do, time that they set aside to do these activities, for lack of a better word, where students can engage that deep spirit. There's a really wide range that we saw in our data: drum circles, dancing, walking a labyrinth, that meditative practice of a path, often that's outside, silence, chant, and singing, but ways that kids were led, supported, taught, formed, given space to engage that part of themselves. And those kind of practices can lead you to awe, can lead you to the power of our interconnectedness, of that creative force. So you talked about religion before and how we interact with that. We can have that conversation. I'm a religious person. I would use the term God, that how we interact with each other, with ourselves, with the transcendent or the universe, that can be awe-inspiring.
Mm. Thanks, Amy. Jim, what's coming up for you? And I'd be interested in how some of these look practically for you all. And talking with you all, there's both kind of a curricular aspect to this work, but there's also the culture change. And I think those are really important to hold together. Are there some specific ways that collegiates integrating this work?
Yeah, I mean, for us, when we first started like thinking about how we were actually going to activate some of this, we see examples of all 11 of these drivers in some version or form already in existence here. And so for us, it was okay. Well, which areas do we feel like make the most sense to jump into? We had to pick a little bit of a starting point in terms of which one. So for us, we really wanted to lean into the intentional lexicon, the inherent worth, the ritual, and the aspirational values piece, kind of initially. Also, like, I mean, I think keeping in mind, like, the power of transformative relationships, and Amy can probably speak to this about why it sort of landed in the center of the wheel better than I can. But what we know here, and what we have all known as educators for a long time, that the power of the relationship is really it's important. I think that we can all think about our own personal experiences in schools and education, and it's probably going to be tough for us to remember the details of Beowulf, but we can remember that English teacher that that really stuck with us and helped us to learn the value of perseverance, or that was able to see us as more than just a student showing up in their classroom, but as a whole human being that had other things going on in their lives and connected with us and that sort of thing. And so I think that when we can oftentimes when we oftentimes think about the really transformative experiences that we've had in schools, it's almost always grounded in transformative relationships with a teacher, or another staff member at that school, or a coach or something like that. So anyway, that was kind of our beginning place with that, and we've done different work in different ways throughout the school year. You mentioned kind of the culture piece and the curricula piece. That for us, like, we really think that a lot of this is cultural work that we need to do, and we need to think about. But the culture is really kind of the foundation, right? If we don't have sort of the right culture that sees and values and hears every human being in our community, that isn't grounded in mutual respect and understanding and things like that, then it's going to be really difficult for us to do any of the really deep and important work, the social emotional learning work that we may want to do, or the more spiritual work. Because if you don't have a culture of like psychological safety, if you will, it's really difficult to sort of go deeper and do a lot of the deeper work that this is going to require, right? If it feels like it's a psychologically unsafe kind of culture. And I think we can all think about times when we were part of a group of some sort where it kind of felt that way. You find yourself holding back and not really wanting to fully engage in something. And that's going to stall out your own development within that community, but certainly impacts the development of everybody else in that community. So we feel like starting with culture is really important. And then out of that, we need to think about, well, how do we go about actually executing on some of these things and teaching these things. This is what's so great about the work that's happening right now and the research that's unfolding, is that we know as educators that we can intentionally teach to these areas, and we can intentionally teach things like emotional recognition and understanding and regulation. We can teach to these skills that for a long time we sort of thought we could, but the research is now confirming and affirming all that. And the research is affirming that when you do this really, really well as a school, when you operate at a really high level in terms of social emotional learning, spiritual curriculum, whatever, all outcomes are improved, right? So it's not just that they socially, emotionally are more sophisticated or advanced. It's like, no, their academic achievement also improves as well. Their sense of self, their self-esteem, all these things get better when schools focus on this and do true like whole child education. When we're looking at their mind, their body, and their spirit. And so in terms of the spiritual piece, for us as a secular school, for us, it really is about helping students and adults in our community understand, like, there's this inner self, there is this inner core that is valuable, that is important, and also like how do we nurture that, develop that inner self, that inner core. And then also there's this connection to something bigger than that ourselves, right? And how do we understand what those connections are? How do we stay connected to those things that are bigger than ourselves, that are important to us? And for everybody, that's going to be different, right? We need to hold space so that everybody has room in our community to connect to those things that are bigger than themselves, that are important to them, right? For some people, that will be a religious practice or whatnot. For some, it will be nature. For some, it will be science. For some, it will be their family, their sports team, whatever it is. But this idea that we're, as human beings, we're all capable of these transcendent connections, and how do we bring awareness to that, and teach young people how to cultivate and develop those connections.
Yeah. And Jim, can you talk a little bit more about that? My sense is when we start talking about spirituality and education, especially in a secular school or a public school, what have been some of the concerns that have been brought up, and how have y'all kind of addressed that around this line between religion and spirituality?
Sure. For us, I mean, the word spiritual and spirituality is a word that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think that was and Amy can probably speak to this on a more global scale than just our school, but that's a word that is one that it takes some work to sort of unpack within your community. And you want to really do some intentional work around defining that in your community, so that you try to bring some clarity and understanding to that. That said, it is also still a word that, again, because it can mean so many things to so many people, I think it's a little bit of it can be a loaded word at times, and it can be hard, even no matter how you define it, for people to really kind of believe or buy into your definition of it. And so, we have to constantly talk about, well, here at our school, the way we are defining that is this it's this inner self and this connection to something larger than yourself. That to us is a spiritual definition. We are not talking about a religious practice or religion. We're not talking about any sort of connection or relationship to religion. But that's oftentimes what people hear when they hear that word, and so we have to work hard to kind of work against that. I'd say that's probably been our one of our largest challenges, is just kind of working through that word and what that word means.
Yeah. And I think especially, I mean, right now we're in the middle of a huge conversation around religion and politics related to the right to choose or abortion rights. And so I think we're even hypersensitive right now. It's like somebody's religion beginning to impede upon my political or educational life or public life. And so I think we're like highly sensitive to that right now. Amy, one of the things I've really appreciated about the work you all have been doing is you've been bringing in scientific research around this. It's not just ideas based upon ideology or somebody's religious worldview. You're actually showing through research that these practices that may be connected or may not be connected are actually good for us as humans outside of any kind of religious ideology. And so I'm really appreciative of that work, because I think that's the way we're going to have to uplift the scientific research to show that this is good for people and it's not based upon somebody's religious worldview or ideology. Can you speak a little bit more about that, Amy?
Absolutely, with pleasure. I think, like Jim, I get that question a lot. What do you mean by spirituality, and how does it connect to religion, if at all? And I answered it the way that I answered it earlier, but also to say that we're not here to invite you into any set of beliefs or practices. That's entirely up to you, what you choose to believe and how you choose to engage that part of your brain. If you're doing it, that's great. I don't need to be involved in that part. It's all good. I get a couple of I get questions along this way in two ways. One is people who are asking for someone else. So I'm okay with the word spirituality, but what would you say if someone had a question? And I think that speaks to the ambiguity of the language around spirituality. Everybody has that. That's evocative. It's an evocative word. It makes us have some feelings. Language is a symbol system, right? So the word spirituality is signaling something to people when they hear it. So I do spend a lot of time saying we mean spirituality. We don't mean religion. If you come from a religious tradition, that's your environment in which you're able to access these parts of your brain, that's terrific. If you don't, there are plenty of other ways in which to do that, right? Someone in the chat mentioned the arts. And that's one we don't talk about nearly enough, of how the arts can really be a source and a place where people can deeply engage that part of their brain and then bring that into dialogue and relationship with other people. When I was at Collegiate, I had a wonderful conversation with the director of fine arts, who was just so dwelling in that space. The other feedback I've gotten a little bit has been, I'm very religious. This isn't for me because this is my system. This is how I understand spirituality. And what you are talking about does not fit into that box. And that's been interesting too. And I think I'm a little bit comfortable with that conversation because I am religious, and saying, when you engage in your religious practices, you're engaging that part of your brain. We want to make sure everybody can have the experience that you're having, even if they don't hold the beliefs that you do, even if they choose to practice in another way than you do. I don't know that that always lands, but for the most part, people hear what I'm saying. I will also say that we come with this scientific background that tends to get us in the door. People can understand that. It makes sense to them. My next step, so we talk about the benefits of people being in MRI machines and being able to talk about spiritual experiences, and these same parts of the brain light up, that nobody has difficulty in understanding what a spiritual experience is. My next step when people ask me that question is to say, have you ever felt a part of something that was larger than yourself? Have you ever felt wonder? Have you ever felt awe? Do you remember what that felt like? Those are the parts of your brain that I'm talking about right now. That's what we want to activate. And I have yet, knock on wood, have yet to have someone who hasn't had that experience. Thank goodness. And that's that science plus experience piece that people then can start to say, I kind of understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. Thank you. And there's so much.
Judd, can I just add one quick
please?
thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I just, as Amy was talking, I think, and then this is where schools come in, right? Like because, schools, like, this is what we do. We do growth and development. Like, this is like our charge, our primary responsibility is to engage thoughtfully, intentionally, based on best practices and research to do growth and development of young people, and to not to sort of say, well, there's this one part of a human being that we're just going to sit over here, and as a school, we're not going to engage in that work, right? Because we're worried about how it might mean this or it might mean that. It's like leaving a big portion, in some, I mean, I would argue the most important part of being a human being, we're leaving that outside the conversation. If all we're talking about is just the reading and the writing and the arithmetic, which are all extremely valuable and important, but we've got to engage in this conversation. The more we ignore it, the more we try not to have it. I think the larger the spiritual void will continue to grow and develop, and take a larger hold over our whole society. I mean, I'm looking at Frank B. Peabody. I mean, he talks about this all the time, and David as well, like in our conversations. And like, this is not just about what's happening at Columbia or what's happening at Collegiate. This is really critical work that's going to be critical to the growth, the development of our whole all of us as human beings, kind of throughout our society and culture. Like we've got to be having these conversations. We've got to be talking about this growth and development piece.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the soul-centric city is all about, is that we've got to begin dealing with these huge dynamics of what it means to be human in some way. I want to bring on, we have an incredible group of people that are on the Zoom call. I want to bring some of those in a little bit, and specifically Jason Heiner is here. And I was saying earlier before we started this program that I was at a Baha'i conference on creating thriving communities. And the conversation really began to focus on how to nurture children. And the Baha'i community has been so beautiful in the sense that they believe, all religions are pointing to this kind of development of a whole person. And they've managed to walk, being a religious tradition, while also being so open to other people and the way they understand that and frame that. Jason, can you just jump into the conversation and share a little bit about what was going on with the Baha'i community and how you're relating to this conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Jed. Thanks. Is my audio okay? Everybody hear me?
Yeah,
all
we're
right?
good. We hear you.
Good. Yeah, thank you. What a profound conversation. And I've definitely learned some new language for expressing some of these ideas today in this, and really grateful for that, and to Amy and Jim. So one of the things that the Baha'i community has been focused on and is focused on for this next, we have what's called sort of a 9-year plan to sort of bring this idea of community building to more people at the local level, at the grassroots level, so at the neighborhood level, really, and then empowering, creating community, not just inside of our religion, but really with all of our friends, family, neighbors. And this conference that we had about building vibrant communities was really about this process. How do we do that? How do we have meetings? There's sort of these core activities that we are creating, where we in our neighborhoods, we try to create often devotional gatherings or prayer meetings, or sometimes we call them wisdom circles. They can go by a lot of different names, where people come together and they bring something that's inspiring to them, that gets to these ideas of what is how can we transcend our normal sort of everyday challenges and issues, to really connect to the things that really do unite us, right? That we all have these longings for transcending those parts of life. And then with that, out of that often grows the need to have consultations with people in the neighborhood, with people in your area, with your friends and family, and about what could we do to make our neighborhood better? What's needed here among the people we know? And often it always comes down to we need to better support children and youth, because they have a number of challenges to navigate, which we could talk about, that are different and are evolving and put a lot of pressure on them in ways that that can disempower them to take interest in their own communities and have a sense of meaning and purpose. And so really, anytime we do community building work, putting children and youth, especially middle schoolers, who often kind of get lost in the shuffle, right? These like 11 to 15-year-olds who are really starting to develop this sense of self and their sense of altruism, and understanding that they're starting to understand there's some problems in the world, and how can we let this happen? Whatever it is, injustice, racial injustice, the environment, gender equality, all of these topics. And they're becoming aware of these things and wanting to know how they can make a difference. And a lot of times we inadvertently kind of disempower them, like, well, just listen, and eventually you'll get your chance, And so these there's a junior youth empowerment program that's part of the work that Baha'is do, that's aimed at middle schoolers. And the thing is it often starts with them, because if you start with them, then they automatically bring in their younger siblings. And then that brings in the opportunity to have these children's classes about attributes like justice, kindness, cooperation, all of these things. And so the Baha'i community uses a set of texts that are meant to be very open to anybody of any religious background or no religious background that could participate in these this empowerment of children and junior youth. And then there's these or middle schoolers, and then there's these study circles for adults too, to sort of explore some of these themes of spirituality and together in a context that is open, that is a place, a space for consultation as well, to think about what could we do to build a better community, and then how can we also always bring along children and youth and give them a voice in their community, let them know that they can walk this path, that we want to walk this path with them. And a lot of it is, as sort of adults, means choosing progress over perfection, right? It means sometimes going slower. If you're involving everyone, if you're involving youth, that you're giving people the chance to explore some of these ideas themselves and make their contributions, even if it takes a little bit longer, right? And it's not perfect. And so those are things that we have to really, be disciplined about if we want to include everyone in. So, sorry, that's a long explanation, but that's what we're trying to do. We don't pretend to have all the answers. We have as many questions, really more questions than answers, but we have a framework that has been tested in over 100 countries around the world using the same kind of community building framework. And so we learn from each other. We learn from people in all parts of the world that are experimenting with this in a lot of different settings: urban, rural, villages, mega cities.
Thanks, Jason. I'm so appreciative of the Baha'i tradition and the ability to recognize other ideological or worldview differences. And it's not about proselytizing or getting them to believe in your concept of God. And it feels like that's the kind of partnerships that need to come together and show that we can have these conversations about spirituality that don't lead to a dismissing of the other's worldview or ideology. They lead to an enhancement of our own by seeing the other perspectives. And I'm excited that our religious tradition is based upon that kind of method and movement. I also want to bring some other folks into the conversation. I've had some great conversations with Frank Peabody, and Frank, I didn't mention that I would love to bring you in. I hope you've been a big driver of trying to promote this type of spiritual education, holistic education. Can you talk a little bit about your vision for that and what brought you to that? Thank you for being a champion for this work and moving that forward.
Thank you, Jason. My background is business, and I was in the consulting business, where we were working with the CEOs of all types of employers and trying to help them with paying their people currently and on a retirement basis. So we had over 100 actuaries working for our firm at one time. Anyway. Once I stopped drinking, when I was 52, I started my windshield started to clear up a little bit. And one of the things that occurred to me was the answer to what had bothered me about a lot of these client relationships, and most specifically with the CEOs or leaders of these employers. I couldn't figure it out. It took me 2 years after I stopped drinking to figure out what it was basically a too great a lack of spiritual grounding, if you will, of those leaders. Being in touch with something that was real, that wasn't superficial, that wasn't just based upon the metrics that stockholders were looking at, et cetera. Now, so I see now that, and I believe this, that what we're all working on here is a transformation that is necessary for the sustainability of humanity. Mm. And the most important part to begin that work is where Jim and Amy are coming from. I also believe that the largest driver of this movement, which is just beginning in terms of the pre-K through 12 school part, the largest driver in a relatively short period of time, 5 to 10 years, is going to be business. And that's a strange thing to conclude when you compare it, put it up next to why my interest developed in this area. But if you look at what's going on in business now, it's very interesting to me. There are a lot of businesses, nowhere near enough, but a lot of businesses that are trying to clean up their act, and they got plenty to clean up. And they're trying to do this by improving the leadership and what that means. And what they're finding is that the most important aspect of leadership is connecting with those that are being led. And it just so happens that that is, in my view, the essence of what spirituality is all about, a compassionate interconnectedness with all life. So business is not just becoming aware of this importance of connecting, but they're starting to recognize it. They have not graduated yet to using the word spirituality, and that's very understandable, but they are very close. There are organizations, I joined one just to find out what was going on, but there are organizations, Conscious Capitalism is probably the best known one in the US, but I've joined one called the Conscious Leadership Guild. These organizations span the globe, and they use words all the way from conscious to quantum to transcendent, anything to steer away from the word spirituality. But just like the rest of society, meaning education, they're going to embrace it. It's inevitable, in my opinion. And they're knocking on the door by using these other words. So I have a particular interest in working and working, trying to make this connection, this link with business, because I do believe that it is going to be the biggest help, because it's got all the money, all the power in the world in terms of pushing this transformation in whole child education.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks so much for the work you're doing in this space. And I agree with you. We're going to be doing some conversations in the fall around spirituality and business, spirituality and corporate life, and would love to engage in those conversations some more. Amy, I want to give you a chance, and I do want to bring in some other questions, or we have a beautiful panel that are involved in this work, and I want to hear what's emerging for you as we talk, like where are you lighting up, what's of interest to you, and let's keep that conversation going. But Amy, I want to come back to you. Tell us about this conference that's happening in the fall that I'm signed up for. I'm going to be there, but it's around helping bring some of this work into schools, the Awaken Schools project. So can you share some more about that, and for those that might be interested, how they can participate?
Of course, I'm delighted to be able to meet you in person. I look forward to that. So October 22nd and 23rd, we will be gathering at Teachers College in New York for 2 days of sharing, discussion, talks, interactive experiences around spirituality and education. So we'll have some keynote speakers to kind of share their wisdom, their experience. We'll be sharing some of our science. We also are inviting people who are doing this work in schools and maybe in informal education programs, right? People who come into schools maybe from the outside, to submit proposals for them to offer workshops and sessions. We'd really love to have as many people from the community, from the wide community, come and share the work that they're doing. One of the great benefits of the last conference that we had in 2019 was people realizing that there was a field that was doing this work, that they were not alone. And we want to keep that energy going, and also to see what's unfolded in the last 3 years, because we know this work continues, and only becomes more robust. So if you'd like to sign up for more updates, to sign up for the conference, to submit a proposal, or just to hear a little bit more, you can go to our website, and I can drop that link in the chat. But we're very excited. October 22nd and 23rd.
Great. Thank you. Look forward to that. I want to open it up to some questions or conversation with other members of the Zoom community. Somebody jump in. Do you have a question? Do you have a comment? What's showing up for you that feels like you have energy around? What's connected to you? So just unmute yourself and jump in. Or yeah, Jim, Amy, any other things that are popping up for you? I guess one of the things that was popping up for me is I wish in my educational experience, both when I was in high school and even in college, there was not permission to talk about these experiences that I'd had that were deeply and profoundly moving. And yet I couldn't even, there was no space in school to even acknowledge them. Like there was this whole part of myself that was having what I would call spiritual experiences or deeply meaningful moments that I couldn't even address in school. Like there was no space, there was no avenue for me to even name some of the most important and dynamic experiences I was having that shaped me as a human being. And so just that we can begin to give each other ways of bringing in all of that fullness of our experience, and not that it needs to be, critiqued or other people have to buy into it, but just that I would have permission to talk about something that was that powerful. And it seems like that's a lot of the work, creating a culture where all of who I am can be seen and belong and be nurtured in some way. What does that bring up for you all? That's what's so exciting to me, is that I want to have a place where my kids can talk about spiritual experience and not feel alienated from that, or not feel shut down because a teacher is afraid it's going to turn into religious talk or talk about, is there a God? I think there's space for all of those questions to come in, because that's what it means for us to be human. But we don't have to, we can bring those in a way that are not creating, we have to agree with each other on them, but some space just to have those conversations. Jim, Amy, anything coming up for you all?
For me, that brings up a thread that I think I've been hearing in what you've been saying, Judd, and what Jim has been saying, and what Frank was saying, and what Jason was saying. We show up at school as a whole human being. So we can choose to meet students as whole human beings, or we could not. And that has implications in the moment for the student who has an existential question and who doesn't need an answer, but needs someone to be able to sit with them as they ask that question. And it has implications for wider society, because all of those kids are already in society and they're going to be in charge of it soon. And so they need to be prepared to be comfortable with those questions and to receive the questions that other people are asking, and to be able to have that dialogue in that space. So I think it's, what you're saying is critically important. And it's both really hard and really radical, and also really easy, right? I don't need to tell you if there's a God or not. I don't need to answer your question. I need to sit there and say, I care about you enough to know that you're asking, so let's talk about that. What do you think it means? That's really hard if you're looking and saying, I have half as much time as I should have to get through this list of things that the state or the government or my department head or whatever is telling me is going to be on this test, or this expectation, or my kid's not going to get into college if they don't know all of these things. If they don't know how to be a person, and they don't realize that they're being seen into being, to quote our data, and also that's a riff on Buddhism, then what kind of people are we sending out into the world?
Yeah, well said. Jackie, join in. Thanks for being on the Zoom today. I'd love to hear your thoughts or comments.
I'm very much interested in what I'm hearing. I work with Jason in a lot of the programs that he's talking about. I was just kind of curious from a research point of view, if it's been done the opposite way, where the teachers of educational programs, be they Baha'i or otherwise, have the capacity. I love those drivers. I mean, because I can see them being utilized in classroom setting and an educational religious classroom setting, but then how to know how to take it to the next step, so that when they go to school and they may not be in a collegiate or a Walden or somewhere that has that capacity, how does that factor in? How can we train or guide the teachers who don't have an educational background to develop this side, but then also make sure that they're catching it on the flip side with the actual, basic parts that they need to, the scientific parts. We all agree that things like science and religion go hand in hand. That's exactly where our teachings are. But when we are teaching in these classes and outlining some of these principles, the teachers are volunteers. They're not educators. So we take those principles. I can see that happening. But has there been any research in determining it the other way?
Good question. Amy or anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I was sort of picked up on what Jim talked earlier, which is relating to this in terms of changing school culture. Being a Waldorf teacher in several schools, this question of spirituality is pretty straightforward. It's not anything in general you find Waldorf teachers shy about. But even in Waldorf schools, you can see that relationship interrupted by what I would call just the image of the child that the teacher carries, the picture of the child, the understanding of the child, the word that has been used here, like having a whole child picture. So responding to what you just said, what I think the beginning of teachers being able to come into the classroom and being able to begin to meet the children in a way that emerges as spiritual inspiration is the image they hold of the child, making sure that they're not just teaching the child's mind, they're not just teaching the child's body, that they respect the personhood of the child. Without that more holistic image as a starting point in that relationship, even I think sometimes when you give people sort of these tools like the drivers and whatnot, and the various artistic and intuitive tools that they have in Waldorf school, if they're carrying an image which narrows them in the relationship with the child, then really creating an environment in which the child can be recognized for who they are, and out of that recognition of who they are, connect with something larger, can be interrupted by what the teacher's carrying as regard to understanding of the child that they're meeting.
Jump, I want to echo that. One of the pieces of Waldorf that the tradition is that you would stay with a child for 3 or 4 years. Is that right, Joppa? Instead of just 1 year? You're on mute still there.
5 to 8 years.
5 to 8 years. And so there's a beautiful example. And a lot of times in schools, you find that, oh, I'm going to see this child's musical ability because I'm a music teacher. I'm going to see this child as a mathematician because I'm a math teacher. But how do we train teachers, no matter what your subject is, to see the whole child, even though you may be focused on a part of it? And I want to offer up, Joppa does this great experience for training teachers on how to create an image, a holistic image of their child at the beginning of the year, so that they know how to invite the fullness of them into the class, even if they're focused on English, even if it's just a type of intelligence, but be able to see the whole child feels really important. So Joppa, thanks for bringing that in. And Amy, you all are doing some, my sense is, work with teachers on how to invite the whole teacher to show up. Isn't that part of it? Is that the teachers ought to be able to show up as whole people. And then that also allows the children to do the same. Is that a true take?
It's completely accurate. So to quote a teacher of mine, we drink from our own wells. You can't show up in the classroom and try to teach from someone you are not, right? It doesn't work. And so we need to nurture teachers into being seen for their whole selves, right? Any student I've ever had could tell you when I had a migraine or when I hadn't slept well that night. That's how I show up in a classroom. They can also tell you when I'm excited and happy and delighted, right? That's true probably of any teacher, anytime throughout the history of education. And students, right? The students pay attention. So part of our work with Awaken Schools has been nurturing that in teachers. And the schools that we work with, I think, do a great job to pick up on what you were just talking about teacher development, formation, training. Part of what we do is also to recognize what teachers are doing well in this area already, right? In some ways, that's reclaiming why you got into teaching, right? I was at my most idealistic when I was 22 and just came out of a teacher education program. I thought I could change the world. And so kind of getting back to that space of I'm here for the kids. How am I making space for that in the crazy busyness that is life in a school? And we did an exercise at Collegiate, which I need to send Jim. I've been remiss in sending this to Jim, so I'll say that publicly, where teachers got to name how they were building these relationships and how they were engaging with all of these drivers. And they didn't have any trouble naming what they were already doing well. And they didn't have any trouble saying, and this is where I want to go next. This is what we need to be able to take it to the next step, which is pretty profound for me to see. So that's the approach that we take of saying, what is it that you're already doing well as you understand these drivers, as you understand this work? And then how can we help you to grow that, to find space to make it even more robust?
Mm-hmm. What's coming up? Thank you, Amy. What's coming up for other folks that you'd like to jump in and join the conversation? What feels important about what's being said? That's kind of a follow-up. We've got about maybe 10 more minutes, so would love to hear some more conversation. One of the things that's coming up for me, and one of the purposes of the Soul-Centric City initiative, is what would it look like if we as a community joined specifically with our schools to create some larger frameworks that we could all be on board with? And this feels like some of the work of 2023 for us. But like the declaration that you all have made, Amy, the Declaration of Education for the 21st Century, I don't know exactly the name of it, but there's some really broad but beautiful principles in that. And I was thinking I would love to be an advocate for JCPS, our public school system here, to adopt that declaration. You know, I know that's that doesn't get into curriculum, that doesn't get into a whole lot of structure, but could it lead for a shared vision of holistic education for the city of Louisville? So, you know, it doesn't have to say, you know, all teachers, now everybody's got to start doing all of this. But are there some broad visions of a world that we want to live into that we can all agree here is, you know, a broader vision of holistic care, and that the schools have their place, churches have their place, families have their place, but we all can agree on some real similar broad statements. I don't know, Amy, if you want to share any more about that declaration. I found it to be very inspiring, and we're going to integrate it into our Soul-Centric City curriculum. What does anybody come? Yeah, Ivy, I see your hand. You got your hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in the conversation.
I wanted to ask Amy if they have had any research done on connecting senior citizens with children and young people, because our country is aging, and the dividing line between the youth and the aged is becoming very wide. And I think that there is a benefit to connect these two pieces of the population in our society that would benefit both. And I was wondering if there was any research or any activities that the education or the spiritual education of children could be to honor the process of aging and being able to relate to each other on a more positive level, and how they can share wisdom and that type of arena. So I just wanted to see if there was any research or any activities across the country that's addressing these two populations.
Beautiful question, Abby. Thank you. I just bow to the question. A lot of times you just bow to the question. Amy?
It's a magnificent question. I wish I had a magnificent answer. I do not know the research in that area, though it makes me want to go and look. So there may well be work that's been done to understand the great depth of learning and sharing and development that can happen in those relationships. I benefited from more than 30 years of being with my grandparents. And so I know that from a personal standpoint. We've also had programs in the schools that I've worked at that do connect. The older generation, I don't know what the more polite way of saying that is, with kids who are in the school.
That's a great
but I don't have any research about it. I don't know. It's a great question.
And Ivy, I want to share your concern there. One of the things we're seeing as people emerge and are no longer practicing in intergenerational communities, which is what congregations really provided for us. And we're beginning to see the breakdown. If you're not participating in a religious congregation, where are the intergenerational communities? And I think the loss of congregational life and the now being in Zoom world, so you can participate in your spiritual practice, but not actually have, those kind of interactions. I think you're naming something for our whole society, Ivy, that is a concern, not only for schools, but how do we create intergenerational space? So thank you for the question. Jim, did you have something you wanted to share?
No, I mean, I couldn't agree. I think it's an excellent question. And just anecdotally, I mean, what we see at collegiate, probably like at a lot of other schools too, is that anytime we have programming and whatnot, where we, invite in either grandparents or special friends, folks that have, who might be involved and engaged in our students' lives, but have a wiser perspective because of their age, that they have so much to offer our kids. I mean, oftentimes the generations that are sort of like closest to or in between the youngest and the oldest generations, I mean, we all get kind of bogged down with sort of a lot of the barriers that seem to exist in life, or the things that are hard. And it's oftentimes our grandparents, our special friends, in those older generations that have the wisdom to say, go for it and inspire us and challenge us to like grow and really develop and look past a lot of the small day-to-day sort of things that can sometimes get in our way. So yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I'm enjoying just like letting it kind of roll around in my brain right now.
Thanks, Jim.
Judd?
Yeah, please, Frank.
I just got to say, I can't see Ivy. I don't know. But anyway, Ivy, if you're still on this thing, thank you for a fabulous, fabulous question. You can see me and you can tell why I relate to the question, I'm sure. But, I think that what occurred to me right off the bat about what you were talking about, selfishly, was the fact that we, meaning we senior citizens or whatever, stand to benefit the most from these kids. They bring a vibrance, a perspective, and a hope to me anyway. I mean, if there were right now, if there were a session at collegiate for to commune with kids on a not an organized basis, but where those kids could speak about their view of life, and where they could transmit energy to the older folks, I'd be there in a second. I think it's a fabulous, fabulous suggestion.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks for backing that up. And maybe that's become another pillar, like intergenerational connection that would be supportive of holistic development. So that's beautiful. David, I see you. Yeah, jump in. Thank you for
Well,
being on the call. And David, all the work you're
I
doing here.
enjoy this immensely. And Abby, I couldn't echo what Frank said louder than it is, because I'm a great believer in, and now I'm part of the older generation. I encourage people to come, young people to come talk to me, because people, when I was younger, some people said, "Oh, they don't want to take time with you." Quite the opposite. They were anxious to tell you, and they appreciated you taking time to talk to them about it. So that's one of my mantras right now, is I want to tell people, don't be afraid to talk. I'm flattered that you've asked me to talk with you about things so I echo exactly what Frank is saying, and I thank Abby immensely for bringing that up, but especially with how many people are turning 65 every day, the aging population. There's an entity in Louisville, if you haven't heard about it, it's called the Thrive Center.
Mm-hmm.
And the Thrive Center was begun by a executive with AT&T who had to spend the last 2 years of her mother's life taking care of her because of her dementia, et cetera. And she then said, we need to create something that for older people to enjoy these times in their life. And so they're working on that. And I mean, I'm already thinking about sessions down to the Thrive Center where we can use that as kind of a library. I mean, a laboratory for this.
Yeah.
This, I think it'd be wonderful.
Thank you, David. And thanks for your support of all this work that's happening. I know you've been a driver of that. I want to bring in just
also, one thing is I'm Louisville centric. I think I'm so excited that Collegiate, that Judd and Frank Peabody got me involved in this quite by accident, asking me if I could get a hold of his Princeton classmate. He wanted to talk to him about something. I said, what do you want to talk to him about? About an hour later, I said, you don't need him, talk to me more. And so anyway, that's enough.
Well, we're glad you're in the conversation, David. Thanks for being a driver of this work. Speaking of intergenerational, I want to bring my son in. My son, Hank Hendricks, who is a music education teacher in North Carolina. And he grew up with his dad being a Presbyterian pastor and then becoming kind of a interfaith Buddhist something. I'm not quite, I call myself a sacred humanist. Hank, what's your interested in the conversation, and speak to us as a music education teacher. I know that line between the sacred and kids' experience of music for you is a very thin line. How do you integrate that, or what's your connection in the conversation? Thanks for being here.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think this kind of stuff is probably easier in my, in music class and in maybe some other special classes, because we're not as kind of bogged down in testing and grading and all this stuff. So I think there's a little bit more time for this side of things. And I have thought and felt, especially recently, that that needs to be more of my focus, because maybe in other areas of school that's not as possible for other teachers. Right now is like testing time, like EOG, end of grade tests, and so there's a lot of energy being put into like different areas of reading, math, testing, scores, and that's important. But I think it's hard, especially this time of year, especially with there's students who've missed, a couple year or more of school, who are there's a lot of catching up that's having to happen right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's hard for, I think a lot of teachers, and almost probably all the teachers at my school, would agree that this kind of work and stuff is important. But if you told them, here's one more thing you need to be worrying about right now, they might have a mental breakdown. So just thinking about how to provide space and time and support for that, especially in like, you know, public school systems where maybe your administration or your, you know, district is not gonna, you know, actively provide you time or support for that. Is kind of hard. So.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. Thanks for bringing in that. How do we move this to the larger district? And I think that's where I really feel like we need to build a larger movement to support administrators. And Frank, probably what you're talking about, like how do we bring in business into this conversation, and having business leaders saying, no, we want this kind of curriculum because that creates the kind of leaders we want to hire. That's a big driver. And so I think the larger society has got to say, this is really important. And we want to hold our school systems, our districts accountable for creating the kind of time that Hank's talking about, where they can bring in these conversations or this fuller curriculum. Well, we're about out of time, but I do want to give Amy and Jim the last word. So Amy and Jim, can you all check out? Just a deep bow to you all for the work you're doing, and know that we're behind you and with you. And this is, as Frank said, I do think the questions we're asking right now are for whether or not humans are going to be able to, to thrive and survive, right? I think these are not tangential questions we're talking about. These are core questions about what it means to be human and how are we going to live together on the planet. Amy and Jim, thanks for your time. I'll offer you all the final words of a checkout. Jim, you want to jump in?
I'll let Amy go last because hers will undoubtedly be much better than mine. But I'll just say that, you know, I thank you so much for including me in this, Judd. This has been a real treat. I've enjoyed sitting here and listening, and it's great to see Hank. It's been a long time. And hearing about the great work you're doing. I think that, you know, I think this is a really exciting time to be in education. I'm, you know, 20 plus years into my career, and I couldn't be more excited than I am right now to be engaged in this work, because I think it's critical. It's important for a gazillion reasons. And I think that there's, I think for schools, like we've got to really get serious about this work. And I think to the point that Hank was getting at, which is that, you know, we as leaders in schools and education, we have to make sure that we're providing the time and the space and putting this at the top of the agenda for our schools, and really making sure that our teachers feel the support to be able to engage in this work. Because I think to you know, to Hank's point, to just put this one more thing on a teacher's plate and say, hey, we need you to do this or emphasize that or whatever, it's really, that's not going to give them the time or space or support to really make it happen. And where all this magic really happens is in our classroom. So we as like administrators and leaders, we have to make sure that we're working hard to create spaces and you know, not just say that this stuff is important, but show in our actions and our allocation of time and resources in our schools that this really is critical work for us to do if we're serious about whole person, whole human growth and development. So
thank you, Jim. Thanks for your time today.
Look
forward to working with you more.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Amy, final words. Thank you.
I don't think I can improve upon that, Jim. It's been my pleasure to be here. This conversation has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed all of the questions and comments from the people who joined us. I think this is the imperative of our time. If we haven't come through the last 3 years realizing that people are disconnected from each other, from nature, from civic responsibility, from that which connects us and is greater than us, we're never going to realize that. And schools are the places where kids learn how to be in community. They are the places that support all other lines of development. If they're not doing this, they're not recognizing that kids show up as whole human beings with deep questions, with awe and reverence, which needs to be supported and fostered. So that's me for 10 seconds on my soapbox. It's critically important. We are a collaborative. It's in our name. So reach out, and we'd love to be in touch and in partnership with you.
Thank you, Amy. And thanks everyone for being on the call today. This has been a really beautiful call and pretty central to the work of cultivating a soul-centric city that we're trying to do here in Louisville. So a deep bow to all of you all. For those that have been watching us on Facebook or on Zoom, we will have the recording up by the end of the week on the Interfaith Paths to Peace website. And you're welcome to see all of the conversations we've downloaded this year, and look forward to almost every Tuesday at 12 o'clock, we're on having another conversation. So I hope you'll come back and join us then. Deep bow to all of you, and may you have a blessed and all filled day. And yeah, may our relationships be transformative relationships. Thank you all. Peace be with you.
Thank you, Judd, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judd.